Peter had spent most of his life trying to stay under the radar. He was a quiet man who lived a peaceful life. But when the 40-year-old woke up one day and noticed bizarre bubbles appear on the tips of his fingers, his life was forever changed. Doctors refused to help him, his friends abandoned him, and in just 24 hours, Peter went from an average man to a medical anomaly who had to be tested, poked, and prodded. But things got worse when the police started knocking on his front door. As we mentioned above, Peter lived a regular life. Some would even call his life boring. He had a routine and he loved following it. However, the 40-year-old was single, and despite going on several dates, he had been unable to settle down. While at times his life got lonely, Peter didn't dwell on that and busied himself with work. And when he had to time off, he would enjoy taking long hikes and ending his days at his local coffee shop. But this simple life changed completely when one day, Peter woke up and noticed his fingers tingling. He didn't think much of it and proceeded with his morning routine. He made coffee and got dressed, but the 40-year-old saw the first alarming signs as he ate breakfast. He looked closer at his fingertips and noticed that the discoloration was hiding inflammation. Trying not to panic, Peter tried his best to understand the situation. While visually his fingertips looked alarming, he didn't feel any pain. This, of course, was reassuring to him, and Peter went about his day hoping that this strange reaction would go away on his own. But with each passing hour, his finger bubbles started getting worse. Finally, Peter noticed that his fingertips were utterly numb. Rather than getting better, it was getting worse, and he was starting to panic. The next few hours were lost in a haze of worry and confusion. The only thing out of the ordinary had been Peter going on a date with a woman he had met online. The two of them had been talking for a few months, and it was the first time they had met in person. While the conversation had been pleasant, Peter didn't feel any sparks and knew there was no future, and after hugging goodnight, the two of them went their separate ways. This was nothing new to Peter, who had gone on many similar dates. Another thing Peter had done yesterday was go on a hike, but this wasn't new. He went on the same trail as before, and as he was familiar with the area, Peter knew not to touch any wild plant life. Peter was trying to remember every tree and branch he had touched yesterday, and wondered if maybe he had come in contact with something poisonous. And with the bubbles only getting worse, he decided to seek medical help. The 40-year-old called ahead and informed the staff about his condition, and even asked if they thought it was anything to worry about. But of course, the person told Peter that he couldn't give any opinion over the phone and would have to come in. He had assumed that just mentioning the bubbles would have raised some alarm, but on call, the hospital staff seemed relatively calm. His appointment was booked for the next day, and the staff reassured Peter that it was not a medical emergency. Peter started noticing a strange warm sensation that began spreading towards his palm and got worse every time he closed and opened his fist. He tried calling the hospital again, but no one bothered even to pick up his calls this time. Peter worried that these bubbles might be a sign of something severe, but with nothing else to do but wait, he tried to calm himself down. But this was easier said than done. The night before his appointment, he kept tossing and turning, desperate for sleep, but his mind kept racing. After a horrible night, Peter was frantic about getting to the hospital. He decided not to wait till his appointment, which was later in the day, and headed straight to the emergency room. While it felt like the right decision at the time, the crowded hospital was in complete disarray, and Peter had to wait 3 hours to have a nurse see him. Peter explained to the nurse how he had an appointment later but felt like he was experiencing a medical emergency, so he decided to come earlier. Rather than being sympathetic to him, the nurse visibly rolled her eyes and asked Peter to show him the problem. But her entire demeanor changed when she saw Peter's fingertips. The bubbles, which had started small, were now the size of small coins and were bright red. Peter knew just by looking at the nurse's reaction that whatever he had was urgent. The nurse quickly asked Peter to recount when the bubbles had appeared and wrote down all his symptoms. She also asked him if she had been in contact with anyone sick or exposed to any virus. Peter confirmed that nothing out of the ordinary had happened to him following the days before the bubbles appeared, to which the nurse raised her eyebrows. It was clear that she didn't believe him. Ready for another lofty wait to see the doctor, Peter got comfortable on the examining table. Still, within minutes of the nurse leaving, a well-groomed and professional-looking doctor arrived, holding his file. The doctor didn't even waste time with pleasantries and immediately started asking Peter questions about his fingertips. He also thoroughly examined the bubbles and told the 40-year-old the news he feared the most. Peter's doctor had no idea what was causing the bubbles. In fact, he had not seen anything like this, but the inflammation was progressing at a rate that alarmed him, and the doctor requested that Peter undergo many tests. While on the surface it looks like a terrible skin reaction, without proper proof, the doctor could not recommend treatment. So, without any option, Peter spent the better part of the day going through several tests. But this was just the start of the long journey. It was going to take 2 weeks for the results to come in, and in the meanwhile, Peter was asked to stay at the hospital. The doctors had no idea how contagious this illness was and needed to keep the 40-year-old in quarantine until sure. With no one to talk to and no entertainment, Peter used this time to reflect on his week before his fingertips started swelling. He went over every detail of the day. Peter had spent the morning getting ready for his hike. He had chosen a very safe trail which he had taken several times, and after that, he had showered and gone on a date. Apart from those two things, nothing else of import happened that day. So Peter was confident that he had gotten this infection from his date or during his hike. But that is when he had a eureka moment. Peter remembered how he had spent a few minutes off trail on his hike. He was actually trying to get a picture and stumbled and tripped. Peter had grabbed hold of a spiky plant with both hands to stop himself from falling. While it had stung for a few seconds, the 40-year-old instinctually felt that this plant was the reason behind the bubbles on his fingertips. So he immediately called the nurse and told her the entire story. Thankfully, this small yet crucial piece of information allowed the doctors to narrow their search for what was causing the bubbles on Peter's fingertips. And finally, they could pinpoint the illness. It turns out the plant was incredibly toxic to humans and was the reason behind the bubbles. However, doctors could also confirm that Peter wasn't contagious, and after a simple round of treatment, he was allowed to return home. Finally, the 2-week saga of painful bubbles on his fingers ended with Peter returning to his old routine and life. Though from now on, the 40-year-old became hyper-vigilant not to touch any unfamiliar plants.